Beyond bombs, what is the source of American power on the world stage? And is our country relying too much on its brawn and not enough on its brains? Our guest today likens national power to playing a symphony, and he says America is missing a lot of notes. And he would know for nearly 50 years, he advised 8 different presidents on some of the biggest and most critical decisions of their administrations. From 2006 to 2011, Robert Gates served as Secretary of Defense to both President George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Before that, he was the Director of Central Intelligence, capping 27 years as an intelligence professional. Now he's sharing what he's learned in his book, Exercise of Power: American Failures, Successes, and a New Path Forward in the Post-Cold War World, now out in paperback. It is an honor to welcome former CIA Director and former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates to the program. Secretary Gates, welcome to Frank Buckley Interviews.
Thank you very much, Frank. Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, sir. Your book is a fascinating insider's view of power at the highest levels of our government over multiple administrations. One administration you did not serve in was the Trump administration. There's been some reporting just this week that former President Trump is trying to enlist conservatives and conservative writers to buy into this undemocratic idea that he can be, quote, reinstated to the presidency. Does this worry you?
No, there is no constitutional means by which he could re-enter the presidency short of running again in 2024.
Before we get to the various threats that our nation is facing from outside, I do want to ask you about this threat from within. As you know, on January 6th, some of our fellow Americans attacked our Capitol. They attacked our officers, and many people worry that somehow our democracy, as we've known it, the one you spent a lifetime protecting, is threatened. Do you agree with that?
I think that the efforts to undermine confidence in the honesty of our elections and in the efficacy of our elections does weaken our country. I think all of the investigations, all of the court cases and so on since the November 2020 election have demonstrated that there was very little fraud. There's been no evidence presented to a judge that was found credible about any significant fraudulent behavior. So I think the effort to undermine confidence in those elections and the notion that future elections might be contested in this same way, I think that is a risk to our democracy, yes.
Let me talk to you about one of these threats that we talked about from outside of our nation that we are facing right now. Just within the past few weeks, we have been subject to cyber attacks, some directly directed at infrastructure in our nation, the folks seeking cyber ransom. How concerned should Americans be about this, and are we countering this threat aggressively enough?
I think people should be very concerned about it. I think that in many respects, cyber is the most dangerous weapon in an arsenal because of its versatility. It can be used for political purposes, as we've seen in our elections and in the French election, in the Brexit vote, in the German elections, and so on, to influence people. It can be used economically, as we've seen with the Colonial Pipeline hack and the JBS meatpacking hack and a variety of others, and it can be used to disable our military capabilities and our communications and our intelligence. So it can be used in a variety of different ways, all of which put us at risk. And you know, we have extraordinary capabilities in this arena. I created Cyber Command in 2010 and made sure that the commander of Cyber Command was also the director of the National Security Agency, so that all of those cyber capabilities that we have can be directed through a simplified chain of command. I think what's been missing is a strategy for how to deal with these cyber attacks, both, well, especially from China and Russia, but also from North Korea and Iran and potentially a variety of others, but especially Russia and China. And I think we just haven't figured out a strategy for pushing back and retaliating for these kinds of activities. Now, these governments, and particularly the Russian government, will say, well, these are not governmental entities and so on and so forth. But it's inconceivable to me that the Russian government and the Russian intelligence services are not aware of these criminal hacking organizations and that they don't operate with official sanction. And so I think we have not been as aggressive as we should be in developing a strategy for pushing back and imposing significant costs on the Russian government for pursuing this path.
You know the threat from Russia as well, if not better than anyone. You came up through the intelligence services as a professional. Many people may not realize you came in as an entry-level employee and rose to be the director of the agency at a time of the Cold War. Do we underestimate Russia to this day, and what should be done to counter it? Or are things happening that we don't even know about?
I think Russia today is very similar to the Soviet Union in this respect. It's a unidimensional power. It only is as an international power because of its military power. Nobody is buying a car built in Russia. Nobody's buying designer dresses created in Russia and so on. No consumer goods, in other words. And they have oil and gas and they have nuclear weapons, and that's about it. So it's a very unidimensional power. I think Russia is a serious disruptive threat in the world. They have the capacity to make a lot of trouble in a lot of different places. But in terms of a long-term rival to the United States, I think Russia is a pale reflection of the challenge posed by China, which is a multidimensional power with great economic, political, intelligence, and other kinds of capabilities.
When you saw President Trump repeatedly taking the side of Vladimir Putin and standing against our own intelligence services, as someone who has spent a lifetime serving our nation and working with these professionals so closely, can you tell me how you reacted to that?
Well, it's always very discouraging when a president essentially echoes the same point of view as the leader of one of our adversaries, and basically in defiance of the intelligence information that has been provided. He may or may not agree with it. I've seen a lot of presidents disagree with the intelligence they've been presented, but in effect publicly to disown it when you're meeting with the leader of an adversarial country, I think is pretty disheartening.
Your book is so interesting, and I alluded to this earlier. You talk about power as a symphony, and how the military aspect is just one part of it, and that you talk about the fact that we become over-reliant on the military in terms of exerting U.S. pressure and power around the world. Can you expand upon that?
Sure. I think what a lot of people don't realize is that although the Cold War between ourselves and the Soviet Union took place against the backdrop of the biggest arms race in the history of the world, because of the catastrophic effects had we gone to war with one another, the Cold War was basically fought out using non-military means of power, whether it was strategic communications or economic means, the denial of technology to the Soviet Union, our technological advances in weaponry as well as in our own economy, our ability to use economic assistance and development assistance around the world in various places. Above all, strategic communications, our ability to communicate our message to send the word inside the Soviet Union what was going on there, and the corruption and incompetence of their government, their behavior in Afghanistan and various other places. These are all elements of power that were actually in many ways decisive in the Cold War because of the weaknesses of the Soviet economy and so on. And the problem is, after the end of the Cold War, we dismantled all these capabilities. The United States Information Agency, that was famously led by Edward R. Murrow in the Kennedy administration and Charlie Wick in the Reagan administration, was amazingly effective, was dismantled, eliminated by the Congress. It was they wanted to eliminate the United States Agency for International Development, and President Clinton saved it, but it was tucked into a corner of the State Department, subordinated to the State Department, and greatly diminished in terms of its capabilities. So a lot of these tools that were so critical to our success in the Cold War, these non-military instruments, were dismantled after the end of the Cold War, and we really haven't rebuilt them. And so now we face a power that has developed these other capabilities far beyond what the Soviet Union ever could have. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, in terms of economic and development assistance around the world, $1 trillion plus program. We have very little to counter that. In the early 2000s, Hu Jintao allocated $7 billion to create a strategic communications capability for China that's now spread their message all over the world and has created a huge infrastructure. The whole science and technology arena, increasing number of foreign students going to China, the outreach of the Chinese to other countries and so on. This is a much more complicated thing than just a military-to-military competition. And the irony is, here is this communist dictatorship that has essentially developed all of these tools that originally we developed to advance our interests, and we're lagging very far behind.
We are here with former Secretary Robert Gates. We will continue the conversation and pick up that thread specifically about China when we come back. Are America's days at the top of the world pecking order numbered? Our guest says they could be, unless we become better and more creative when it comes to using our power on the world stage. Welcome back to Frank Buckley Interviews. Our guest is former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. His book, Exercise of Power: American Failures, Successes, and a New Path Forward in the Post-Cold War, is out now in paperback. Secretary Gates, I want to ask you about China. We were just talking about that a moment ago. How would you characterize its place in the world in 2021?
Well, I think the perception on the part of a lot of people around the world is that the Chinese are a dynamic rising power that is challenging the United States in kind of every dimension, and the message that Chinese are putting about that Xi Jinping has talked about himself is that we are the declining power. I don't believe that's the case, but clearly we have a lot of internal challenges, and we have a hard time getting anything of any consequence done in this country of any significant measure, just like infrastructure. So that's the perception. I don't think it's the reality, but it could be.
You one of the threats that you talk about is what is happening in the South China Sea and the Chinese expansion there. You take former President Obama to task on that. What is happening there? And for folks who are not aware, why should we be concerned about something so far away from us?
Well, first of all, a significant proportion of global trade passes through the South China Sea. It's also of considerable strategic importance because in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, you have Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, and so on. So in terms of the global balance of power, in terms of the global economy, the South China Sea is very important. And China basically now claims all of the South China Sea, or virtually all of the South China Sea, to be its own, ignoring the interests and the legitimate claims that a variety of other countries have economically and otherwise in that area. It has become a problem because the Chinese have become very aggressive in militarizing the South China Sea. They have created a series of artificial islands that they have militarized. Interestingly enough, President Xi Jinping looked President Obama in the eye and promised him that they would not militarize these new islands, and then they turned around and did just that. So he flat out lied to the president about what their intentions were, and these obviously have some military utility should there be a conflict there. But Chinese are becoming much more aggressive in challenging the Taiwanese in their air defense identification zone and in the Taiwan Strait and so on. So it's an increasingly dangerous part of the world.
Let me quote from the foreword to your book, where you write about this. You say there have been U.S. successes in the international arena during the past quarter century, but the overall trend for us in the global arena has been negative despite our braggadocio. Tell me what you meant by that.
Well, the United States has been at war for 20 years, has spent probably several $1 trillion, a lot of lives, in two conflicts that it would be hard to characterize as complete successes. I think there have been some gains as a result of those conflicts, but we've paid a lot for that limited progress in both Iraq and Afghanistan. By the same token, over that period of time, we have become increasingly unable as a country to deal with any of our own problems, our domestic problems. We've always been polarized as a country. The things that Jefferson and Adams said against each other during their political campaign would fit right into today's campaigns. But what's new is paralysis, and that's new since the end of the Cold War. And we can't get anything big done in this country, whether it's infrastructure or immigration legislation or education. We have a variety of big problems that we just seem to be unable to tackle. And it's going to be very tough for us to challenge the Chinese and to beat them in a variety of different ways. And by that I mean gain the advantage in terms of our competition if we can't solve any of these problems here at home and frankly prove the argument that we're declining to be false. And I think that's the burden on us is to show by actions here at home that this country is in fact resilient, that we can overcome our political differences, and move the country forward and reassert our global leadership role, which I think is how we best protect our own interests. You know, people talk about an America First policy. I think every president has to have an America First policy, that his first job is to protect the United States and advance our interests. The question is, how best do you do that?
Right.
I happen to believe, and a lot of others happen to believe, that you best advance your interests by a leadership role around the world that advances those interests.
All right. Mr. Secretary, we're going to take one more break. When we get back, we'll be back with more with former Secretary of Defense, former Director of the Intelligence Agency, Robert Gates. And we're back. The former Secretary of Defense and Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Robert Gates. Secretary Gates, I wanted to ask you to respond to this quote here again from your book. You say China is ascending, likely at some point to surpass the United States in terms of gross domestic product. Russia, modernizing its military apace, is aggressively threatening and attempting to destabilize Western democracies and dominate its neighbors. North Korea has become a wild card nuclear power. The Middle East remains a sinkhole of conflict and terrorism. It sounds like the kind of thing that you would have said in a brief in the Oval Office when you were with CIA. And I just wondered, obviously, so many threats. You were in the middle of it all for so many years. Do you miss being in that arena day in and day out?
You know, Frank, I joined CIA 55 years ago this summer. And to tell you the truth, I don't miss it at all. There's a lot of challenges and a lot of work out there. It's time for a new generation to tackle those challenges.
Well, let me ask you about that. If you can inspire a young person who is thinking about going into public service as you have, what would you say to them?
I would say that despite all of the pitfalls and the criticism and things you read about, public service, and particularly in our intelligence services and the military, is an immensely gratifying way to spend at least a part of your life.
When you entered the CIA as a young, I believe it was an analyst, did you ever think, wow, maybe someday I could rise to be the director of Central Intelligence?
Not a chance. I thought I'd work for CIA for a few years and then go teach Russian and Soviet history in a college someplace. So I always advise young people today, you know, it's important to do all the hard work of preparation, but you need to understand that there are going to be opportunities that come along that you don't anticipate, and you need to be willing to jump at them.
Mm. When you think about all the attacks that intelligence professionals have been under in the past few years, this talk of a deep state and things of this nature, you didn't speak out a lot about it, but I just wondered, what are your thoughts on the attacks that your fellow professionals came under?
You know, the truth is, Frank, that intelligence professionals have been in the crosshairs of critics throughout CIA's existence. All you have to do is think back to, you know, the questions of the missile gap at the end of the Eisenhower administration, and the fact that CIA failed to foresee the Soviet military, Soviet space program, and so on. The criticisms in the 70s of underestimating Soviet military power, criticisms relating to the Vietnam War, Iran-Contra, the Church Committee findings in the mid-70s. So anybody who goes into the intelligence business in a democracy has to realize that, you know, you're always going to be in the crosshairs and you're always going to be criticized. And part of the problem is that you can't defend yourself. And President Kennedy put it very well. He said, you know, your failures will be, and we'll ever know. I think in one way that's why there was such gratification over the killing of Osama bin Laden. That was a great achievement of CIA's analysts figuring out where he was, and then of our special forces, of the SEALs in bringing him to justice. And it showed the professionalism of both our intelligence community and our military at its very best. And we don't get very many opportunities to do that publicly.
You've never been pulled into the vortex of politics, and you certainly could have been. And I suspect some people would have wanted you to run, and maybe they still want you to run for an elected office. Is that something you would consider now as the elder statesman with all this experience in your back pocket? And why didn't you run before?
Well, I have zero interest in doing that. I might add it also probably would lead to an immediate, instant divorce, which would be too high a price. But people have different levels of interest, and I always say everyone has an ego. Some people's egos need to be fed by a lot of publicity and being out in front. Some people's egos are satisfied by working behind the scenes and trying to get things done in a way that may not get public attention or acclaim, but advance the interests of the country in any event. And I had some role models in that regard. And that was always quite sufficient for me.
Mr. Secretary, we can't thank you enough for your service to our nation and, of course, for being with us on the program today.
Thanks a lot, Frank.
Thank you, sir. Hope you enjoyed today's podcast, and if you're not a subscriber, I hope you'll do it today. It's free, of course, and it'll ensure that you won't miss a single episode of our podcast, which drops every week on Wednesday. We have some 240 episodes in our archives that you can listen to at any time on demand. You can also see our interviews on KTLA on the weekends and on YouTube. As always, thanks for sharing us on social media with your friends. Tag me when you do. I'm Frank Buckley TV on Twitter and on Instagram. Thanks for listening, and until next time, I'll see you on TV.